I never thought the worst pain of my life would come from my own son's absence. Standing there beside my husband's casket, surrounded by people who had loved Robert for 30 years, I kept glancing toward the chapel doors, waiting for Dylan to walk through them, waiting for my boy, my only child, to show up and hold my hand like he used to during thunderstorms when he was small. But those doors never opened for him. The funeral director had asked me 3 times if we should wait a few more minutes. "Sometimes traffic delays people," he said gently, his eyes full of the kind of pity that made my stomach turn. I just shook my head. Deep down, I already knew Dylan wasn't coming. Not because he couldn't, but because he chose not to. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. I held my composure through the entire service, even when Robert's best friend Frank broke down during the eulogy. Even when our neighbor Mrs. Patterson squeezed my hand so tight I thought she might break my fingers. I smiled when people shared memories of Robert's terrible dad jokes and his obsession with fixing things that weren't broken. I thanked everyone who offered condolences, accepted their casseroles and promises to call if I needed anything. But inside, I was drowning in a silence that felt louder than any scream. The empty space beside me at the front pew seemed to grow larger with each passing minute. Dylan's absence was so profound it became its own presence, a cold, cruel reminder that the son I had raised, nursed through fevers, cheered at soccer games, and loved unconditionally for 28 years, had abandoned me in my darkest hour. People whispered excuses for him. "Maybe he's stuck at work," said my sister Carol, though we both knew Dylan ran his own consulting business and could leave whenever he wanted. "Perhaps he's grieving in his own way," offered Robert's brother, though Dylan hadn't visited his father once during the final 6 months of his battle with cancer. I knew better. I knew my son, even if I no longer recognized him. The change had started 2 years ago when Robert received his diagnosis. At first, Dylan seemed concerned, asking about treatment options and offering to drive his father to doctor's appointments. But as the medical bills grew and Robert's condition worsened, something shifted in Dylan's demeanor. He stopped asking about his father's health and started asking about finances. "Dad's retirement savings must be taking a hit with all these treatments," he'd say during our weekly phone calls that gradually became monthly, then stopped altogether. "Are you going to be okay financially when—" He never finished that sentence. But I heard what he wasn't saying. "When Dad dies." The last conversation I'd had with Dylan was 3 weeks before the funeral. I'd called to tell him the doctors had given Robert 2 weeks to live, that he should come say goodbye. Dylan's response still echoed in my mind. "I'm really busy with work right now, Mom. Maybe next weekend." Next weekend came and went. So did the weekend after that. Robert died on a Tuesday morning while I held his hand. Dylan was nowhere to be found. Standing in that chapel, accepting condolences from people who had made time to honor my husband's life, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart, that had been breaking slowly for months. This was deeper, more fundamental. It was the sound of unconditional love meeting its limits, the moment when a mother's endless capacity for forgiveness finally encountered something unforgivable. The boy who used to crawl into our bed during storms, who cried when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly, who once told me I was his favorite person in the whole world, that boy was gone. In his place stood a man I barely recognized, someone who could calculate the worth of his presence against his convenience and find me lacking. After the service, after the last guest had left the cemetery, after I'd stood alone beside the fresh grave for longer than I should have, I drove home to the empty house that still smelled like Robert's aftershave and the get-well flowers that were now wilting on every surface. That's when I found the first message on my answering machine. Dylan's voice, casual and businesslike. "Hey, Mom. Sorry I missed the service. Work emergency. Anyway, I know this is difficult timing, but we should probably talk about Dad's will soon. I know he left everything to you, but we discussed my inheritance before he got sick. I'll come by this weekend to sort things out." My inheritance. As if Robert's life insurance policy and the modest savings we'd accumulated over 30 years of marriage were simply money waiting to be divided rather than the foundation of security Robert had worked his entire life to provide for me. I played that message 3 times, each repetition driving home the brutal reality that my son saw his father's death not as a loss to be mourned, but as an opportunity to be seized. The boy I'd raised had been replaced by a stranger who could schedule grief like a business meeting and reduce love to a line item in an estate plan. But what Dylan didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd stopped listening to me months ago, was that Robert's will contained something Dylan hadn't expected, a condition that would change everything. I sat in Robert's favorite chair that night, surrounded by sympathy cards from people who understood the value of showing up when it mattered, and I made a decision. Not born from anger, though I was angry. Not from a desire for revenge, though Dylan's callousness deserved consequences. I decided to honor Robert's final wish, even if it meant losing my son forever. Because sometimes, love means letting people face the truth about who they've become, even when that truth is harder to bear than their absence. 3 days after I buried my husband, Dylan finally showed up. Not with flowers, not with an apology, not even with the decency to look ashamed. He arrived on my doorstep wearing his expensive suit, the one Robert had helped him buy for his first big client meeting, carrying a leather briefcase like he was conducting business with a stranger. "Mom," he said, stepping past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. His eyes immediately scanned the space, taking inventory of everything Robert had left behind. The antique clock his grandfather had given us, the original paintings we'd collected over the years, the mahogany dining set we'd saved 2 years to afford. I watched my son catalog my life like an appraiser, and something cold settled in my stomach. "I brought coffee," I offered, clinging to the rituals of motherhood even as they felt increasingly hollow. "The good kind, from that place you used to like downtown." Dylan was already pulling papers from his briefcase. "I can't stay long, Mom. I have a conference call in an hour." He spread documents across Robert's reading table, the same table where my husband had written me love notes on our anniversaries, where he'd helped Dylan with homework countless evenings when homework mattered more than money. "These are copies of Dad's will and the insurance policies," Dylan continued, his voice taking on the professional tone he used with clients. "I had my attorney review everything. There are some discrepancies we need to address." Discrepancies. As if love could be audited like a tax return. I sat down across from him, studying the face that had once been so familiar. Dylan had Robert's strong jaw and my green eyes, but there was something cold behind those eyes now, something calculating that hadn't been there when he was the boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. "Dylan," I said softly, "we just buried your father. Don't you think we should—" "Mom, I know this is hard, but waiting won't make it easier." He pulled out a yellow highlighter and began marking sections of text. "Dad promised me that when the time came, I'd receive my fair share. Half of everything, including the house. Half of everything, including the house where I'd raised him, where Robert and I had built 30 years of memories, where I was supposed to spend whatever years I had left, surrounded by the echoes of a love story that had been cut short by cancer, but never by choice. Your father never said anything to me about, maybe he didn't want to upset you while he was sick," Dylan interrupted, not looking up from his papers. "But we talked about it last year. He understood that I have my own financial obligations now. The consulting business has overhead, and Sarah's been looking at houses in better neighborhoods." Sarah. His girlfriend of 8 months, a real estate agent who wore designer clothes and spoke about investment properties, the way other people discuss the weather. I'd met her twice, both times briefly, both times feeling like she was evaluating my home's market value rather than getting to know her boyfriend's family. "He wanted to make sure I was taken care of," Dylan continued. "But he also recognized that I'm building my own future. This inheritance isn't just money, Mom. It's my foundation for the life I'm trying to create. The life he was trying to create. As if the life Robert and I had created together was somehow less valuable, less worthy of protection and preservation. I watched my son reduce his father's legacy to numbers on a spreadsheet, and I remembered the day Dylan had called us in tears because his college girlfriend had broken up with him. Robert had driven 4 hours to bring him home for the weekend, and we'd spent 3 days making his favorite meals and listening to him work through his heartbreak. When he finally smiled again, he'd hugged us both and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you guys." Now I was finding out. The life insurance alone is worth $800,000, Dylan was saying, running his finger down a column of figures. Plus, Dad's retirement accounts, the savings. This house is worth at least $400,000 in today's market. We're talking about real money here, Mom. Real money. As if the love Robert had poured into earning every dollar wasn't real. As if the nights he'd worked overtime to pay for Dylan's college tuition weren't real. As if the sacrifices we'd made to build security for our family weren't real. I'll need to have the house appraised, Dylan continued, making notes in the margins of legal documents. And we should probably put it on the market fairly quickly. The real estate market is strong right now, but that could change. Put it on the market. He was talking about selling my home, the place where Dylan had taken his first steps, where we'd celebrated every Christmas morning, where Robert had proposed to me 31 years ago in the kitchen over burnt pancakes and instant coffee. Dylan, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, this is my home. He finally looked up from his papers, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of the boy I'd raised, but it passed quickly, replaced by the impatient expression of a man who didn't have time for sentiment. I know it has emotional value, Mom, but you don't need a 4-bedroom house. There are nice senior communities with maintenance included, activities, other people your age. You'd probably be happier. Other people my age. As if at 56, I'd already been relegated to some waiting room for death, as if my life was winding down rather than simply changing direction. Sarah found some great places online, Dylan added, pulling out his phone to show me listings he'd already researched. Look at this one. It's got a pool, a library, scheduled social events. Much more practical than maintaining this big house by yourself. Practical. Dylan had turned into someone who measured everything by practicality, who couldn't see the difference between a house and a home, between an asset and a sanctuary. I looked at the photos on his phone, sterile apartments with beige walls and industrial carpeting, communal spaces designed for people who'd given up on the idea that life could still hold surprises and joy, and the kind of deep satisfaction that came from waking up in a place that held your history. I'm not ready to move, I said simply. Dylan's jaw tightened, the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when he didn't get his way. Mom, be realistic. You can't afford the maintenance on this place without Dad's income. The property taxes alone are $12,000 a year. The insurance, utilities, upkeep, it doesn't make financial sense. Financial sense. Everything in Dylan's world had to make financial sense, as if love and comfort and belonging were luxuries that could be calculated against a bottom line. I could get a part-time job, I suggested, though the words felt strange in my mouth. I hadn't worked outside the home in 25 years, had devoted myself to creating the kind of stable, nurturing environment that had allowed Robert to build his career and Dylan to pursue his dreams without worry. Dylan laughed, and it wasn't a kind sound. Mom, you're 56 years old with no recent work experience. Who's going to hire you for anything that pays enough to maintain this lifestyle? The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. This was my son, the child I'd sacrificed my own career to raise, dismissing my worth as if all those years of unpaid labor, the cooking, cleaning, carpooling, homework help, sick days, school events, emotional support, had been nothing more than elaborate hobbies that hadn't prepared me for the real world of employment. I thought about all the times I'd defended Dylan to Robert when his grades slipped or when he made poor choices. He's just finding himself, I'd say. He'll figure it out. Robert would nod and write another tuition check, another car payment, another down payment on an apartment Dylan couldn't quite afford on his own. We'd been so proud when his business finally took off, when he started making real money and could support himself independently. We thought we'd raised a son who would remember where he came from, who would honor the sacrifices that had made his success possible. Instead, we'd apparently raised someone who saw our investment in his future as a debt he didn't owe, who could calculate his inheritance down to the penny, but couldn't calculate the worth of showing up to his father's funeral. Dylan was packing up his papers, checking his watch with the impatience of someone who'd completed an unpleasant but necessary task. I'll have my attorney draw up the paperwork, he said, snapping his briefcase closed. We can probably have everything settled within a month. Everything settled. 30 years of marriage, a lifetime of love. memories that couldn't be quantified or divided, all of it reduced to paperwork that could be settled within a month. I spent the next week trying to find my son somewhere inside the stranger who had invaded my living room with spreadsheets and demands. Maybe if I could remind him of who he used to be, I could bring back the boy who had once promised to take care of me when I got old. I called him every day. Most times, it went straight to voicemail. When he did answer, our conversations felt like business transactions, brief, efficient, devoid of anything resembling warmth. "Dylan, honey, I was thinking maybe we could have dinner this weekend," I said during one of these hollow exchanges. "I could make your favorite pot roast, the one with the carrots you used to love." There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background. "I can't, Mom. Sarah and I have plans. We're looking at properties. Properties, always properties, investments, financial opportunities. Never homes, never places where memories might be made." "What about next weekend?" I pressed, hating the desperation I could hear creeping into my voice. "Look, Mom, I'm really busy right now. The business is expanding, and this inheritance situation needs to be resolved quickly. Can we just focus on getting the paperwork done?" The inheritance situation. That's what I had become to my own son. A situation to be resolved. 2 weeks after Robert's funeral, Dylan arrived for what he called the house walkthrough, bringing Sarah with him for the first time since Robert's death. She swept through my home like a hurricane in designer heels, measuring rooms with her phone and taking photos of everything. "The kitchen could use updating," she announced to Dylan, as if I weren't standing right there. "But the bones are good. Original hardwood throughout, good natural light. We could probably get asking price, maybe more if we stage it right." We. As if she had any claim to the home Robert and I had built together. I watched her examine my wedding china like she was appraising merchandise at an estate sale. These were the dishes my mother had given me. Plates that had served Thanksgiving dinners and birthday cakes, and countless ordinary meals that had made up the substance of our family life. "This stuff is pretty outdated," Sarah said, holding up one of my grandmother's crystal glasses to the light. "We should probably donate most of it. Nobody wants this heavy, old-fashioned stuff anymore. Nobody wants this." She was talking about the tangible pieces of my history, the objects that connected me to the women who had come before me, as if they were worthless clutter rather than precious links to my past. Dylan nodded along with everything she said, occasionally adding his own observations about maximizing market appeal and reducing emotional attachments that could interfere with the sale process. Reducing emotional attachments. My son was talking about my life, my memories, my connection to the only home I'd known for decades, as if love were a character flaw that needed to be corrected. "What about this?" Sarah asked, pointing to the piano in the corner. The baby grand Robert had surprised me with for our 20th anniversary. I'd played it every evening for 10 years, filling our home with music that had provided the soundtrack to Dylan's teenage years. "Mom doesn't really play anymore," Dylan said dismissively. "It's just taking up space." I stared at him in shock. Just last Christmas, he'd asked me to play Silent Night, while he and Robert sang along, their voices harmonizing in the way they'd done since Dylan was small enough to sit on Robert's lap during our evening music sessions. "I play every day," I said quietly. Dylan looked at me with surprise, as if he'd forgotten I was capable of having preferences or activities that didn't revolve around his needs. "Well, anyway, it won't fit in a senior community apartment." That phrase again, senior community apartment. In Dylan's mind, I'd already been relocated, reduced to someone whose life could be contained in 800 square feet of beige efficiency. Sarah was in the master bedroom now, opening closets and drawers with the casual invasiveness of someone who'd never learned that other people's private spaces deserved respect. "Most of this clothing will have to go," she called out. "The closet space in these older homes is really inadequate by today's standards." She was examining Robert's clothes, suits that still smelled like his cologne, shirts I hadn't been able to bring myself to touch since he died. Her hands moved through his things with the detached efficiency of someone sorting inventory, and I felt something shatter inside my chest. "Please don't touch those," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked up with mild irritation. "Marie, I know this is emotional, But you're going to have to deal with this stuff eventually. We can arrange for a donation pickup if that makes it easier. A donation pickup. She wanted to have Robert's clothes hauled away like garbage, as if the man who had worn them had never existed, as if the love those garments represented could be eliminated with a phone call to Goodwill. Dylan appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, making notes about square footage and renovation potential. Sarah's right, Mom. You can't keep everything. It's not healthy to hang on to stuff that just makes you sad. Stuff. My husband's belongings were stuff. The physical remnants of a 30-year love story were unhealthy obstacles to my emotional progress. These aren't just stuff, I said, my voice stronger now, rising from some deep place I'd forgotten existed. These are your father's clothes. The blue shirt he wore to your college graduation, the tie I gave him for Father's Day, the jacket he wore when he walked you down the aisle at your friend's wedding when her father couldn't be there. Dylan's face flickered with something that might have been recognition, but it passed quickly. Mom, you're being emotional. Dad is gone. Keeping his clothes isn't going to bring him back. Being emotional. As if the capacity for feeling deeply was a flaw rather than a gift. As if the ability to love beyond reason was something to be ashamed of rather than treasured. Maybe we should take a break, I suggested, desperate to stop the systematic dismantling of everything that made my house a home. This is all happening so fast. Sarah and Dylan exchanged a look, the kind of glance that passed between conspirators, people who shared an understanding that excluded everyone else in the room. Mom, Dylan said with the patient tone people use with children or elderly relatives who aren't grasping simple concepts, delaying this isn't going to make it easier. The market is good right now. We need to move while we can maximize the return on the investment. Return on the investment. That's what Robert's life had become in Dylan's calculations. An investment that needed to be liquidated for maximum return. That evening, after they left with promises to be in touch soon about next steps, I sat in my empty kitchen and tried to understand how the child I'd raised could have become someone capable of such casual cruelty. This was the boy who had cried when our dog died, who had insisted on a funeral and a marker in the backyard. This was the teenager who had written me a Mother's Day card saying I was his hero and his best friend. Somewhere along the way, that capacity for tenderness had been replaced by something cold and calculating. Somewhere in his journey to adulthood, Dylan had learned to see people as resources to be managed rather than relationships to be cherished. I found myself remembering the day he'd brought his first girlfriend home for dinner. He'd been so nervous, changing clothes 3 times and asking me a dozen questions about what to cook. I want her to like you, Mom, he'd said. Your opinion matters to me. Now his girlfriend was cataloging my possessions like a vulture picking through carrion, and Dylan was helping her do it. The phone rang around 9 o'clock. Dylan's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment, my heart lifted with hope that maybe he was calling to apologize, to acknowledge that today had been hard for me, to remember that he was supposed to love me. Mom, I forgot to mention, Sarah thinks we should get the house professionally appraised right away. She knows someone who can do it this week. Also, we're going to need you to start going through Dad's personal papers. There might be additional assets we haven't accounted for. Additional assets. Even Robert's private papers, the letters he'd written to me, the journal he'd kept during his illness, the photos he'd saved from our early years together. All of it was being reduced to potential additional assets. Dylan, I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay strong. I miss him so much. I miss your father every moment of every day, and I miss you too. I miss the son who used to care about my feelings. There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a heartbeat, I thought maybe I'd reached him. Maybe I'd found some small corner of his heart that still remembered how to love. Then he sighed. The sound of someone dealing with an inconvenient emotional outburst. Mom, grief is normal, but you can't let it cloud your judgment about practical matters. Dad would want us to handle this responsibly. Dad would want. Dylan was invoking his father's memory to justify dismantling everything Robert had worked to build, using Robert's name to legitimize the destruction of Robert's legacy. That night, I stood in the bedroom I'd shared with my husband for over a decade and looked at the empty spaces where Dylan and Sarah had mentally rearranged my life. I could almost see the moving boxes in their minds, the efficient disposal of everything that made this place home, the transformation of love into liquid assets. But they didn't know about Robert's final letter, the one he'd written to me during his last week, when he'd still had strength to hold a pen but could barely speak above a whisper. They didn't know about the conversation we'd had about Dylan, about Robert's growing concern that our son was losing his way, and they certainly didn't know about the condition in Robert's will, the condition that would change everything. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after Robert's funeral. I was sitting at the kitchen table where Robert and I had shared 30 years of breakfast conversations, staring at legal documents Dylan had dropped off the night before, papers that would dissolve my life into percentages and distribution schedules, forms that reduced 3 decades of love to signatures and notarized stamps. Dylan hadn't even come inside when he'd delivered them. He'd stood on the porch like a process server, handed me the manila envelope and said, "Just sign where the attorney marked. Sarah found a buyer who's willing to pay cash and close quickly." A buyer. Already. My home had been sold before I'd even agreed to sell it. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and found page after page of legal language I didn't understand. But the intent was clear enough. I was signing away everything. The house, my security, my right to remain in the place where Robert and I had built our life together. At the bottom of the final page, someone had placed a yellow sticky note with an arrow pointing to a signature line. Dylan's handwriting, the same careful script I'd helped him perfect when he was 7 years old, spelled out a single word: here, here. That's all the instruction I got for signing away my life. Here. I set the papers aside and walked through my home, really seeing it for what might be the last time. The living room where Dylan had built pillow forts and where Robert had taught him to play chess. The kitchen where we'd celebrated every birthday with homemade cakes and where I'd nursed Dylan through childhood illnesses with soup and crackers served on his favorite plate. The master bedroom where Robert and I had whispered our dreams in the dark, where we'd planned Dylan's future and worried about his grades and celebrated his successes. The guest room that had been Dylan's nursery, then his bedroom, then his temporary refuge when he'd needed to come home during college breaks. Every room held ghosts of the family we'd been, echoes of the love we'd shared before death and greed had torn us apart. I found myself in Dylan's old room, standing before the dresser where I'd once kept his baby pictures, his school awards, the Father's Day cards he'd made in elementary school with construction paper and glitter. Sarah had been right. I'd kept too much, saved too many memories of a boy who no longer existed. On the dresser sat the only item Dylan had specifically requested during his inventory tour, a small wooden box Robert had made for him when he was 12. Dylan had used it to store his baseball cards, his allowance money, the little treasures that seemed important to a child's heart. I picked up the box, feeling its familiar weight, remembering Robert working on it in the garage, sanding each corner smooth, applying coat after coat of protective finish. "It needs to last," he'd said. "Boys are hard on their treasures." Inside, I found things Dylan had apparently forgotten when he'd taken the box. A few baseball cards he'd missed, a ticket stub from the first movie Robert had taken him to see, a photo of the 3 of us at Dylan's high school graduation. We looked so happy in that picture, so unaware that happiness could be temporary, that love could have conditions, that families could break apart not from tragedy, but from simple selfishness. At the bottom of the box, I found something that made my breath catch. A letter in Dylan's teenage handwriting, addressed to future me. He'd written it during his senior year of high school, an assignment for English class about goals and values and the person he hoped to become. I unfolded the paper with careful fingers, and Dylan's 17-year-old voice spoke to me across the years. "Dear future Dylan, I hope you remember what matters. I hope you remember that Mom and Dad sacrificed everything for you, and that family is more important than money. I hope you're successful, but not so successful that you forget where you came from. I hope you take care of Mom and Dad when they get old, like they took care of you when you were young. I hope you remember that love is the only thing that really lasts. Love is the only thing that really lasts." I read those words 3 times, tears blurring my vision as I held proof that my son had once understood what truly mattered. Somewhere inside the calculating stranger who was dismantling my life was the boy who had written these words, who had understood that family was sacred, that love was precious, that taking care of each other was the point of everything else. But that boy was gone, or buried so deep beneath years of ambition and materialism that he might as well be dead. I carried the letter to the kitchen and sat staring at it while the legal papers waited for my signature. Here was evidence that I'd raised my son right, that the values Robert and I had tried to instill had taken root, at least for a while. Somewhere along the way, Dylan had forgotten his own wisdom, traded his integrity for success, lost his soul in pursuit of financial security. The phone rang around noon. Dylan's voice, brisk and businesslike. "Mom, did you sign the papers yet? The buyers want to close next week." Next week. 7 days to pack up 30 years of memories and find somewhere else to live. "Dylan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I found something in your old room. A letter you wrote to yourself in high school." "What letter?" He sounded distracted, probably multitasking, reviewing other deals while he waited for me to sign away my home. "You wrote about taking care of your parents when they got old, about remembering that family is more important than money." There was a pause, the sound of typing stopping. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd reached him. Maybe the boy who had written those words was still alive somewhere inside the man who was destroying me. "Mom, that was high school. I was 17. People change, priorities change. I can't live my life based on some idealistic essay I wrote as a teenager. People change. Priorities change. As if the capacity for love and loyalty were childish things to be outgrown. As if wisdom was learning to value money over family. As if growing up meant becoming someone who could betray the people who loved you most. I just thought, look, I don't have time for this right now. Sarah's showing the property to another potential buyer this afternoon, and I need to know if you're going to cooperate or if we need to pursue other options. Other options. The threat was subtle but clear. Sign willingly, or be forced to sign through legal means. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my kitchen, surrounded by the absence of everything that had once made my life feel whole. Robert was gone. Dylan was gone. Not dead, but lost to me in ways that felt worse than death. The boy I'd raised, the family I'd built, the future I'd planned, all of it had vanished like smoke, leaving me alone with legal papers and a stranger's ultimatum. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since Robert's diagnosis. I went to the cemetery. I sat beside his grave and told him everything about Dylan's coldness, about the papers waiting for my signature, about the letter I'd found that proved our son had once been the person we'd believed him to be. "I don't know what to do," I whispered to the marble headstone that bore Robert's name and the dates that bracketed our life together. "I don't know how to fight someone who was supposed to love me." The wind rustled through the trees overhead, and for a moment, I could almost hear Robert's voice reminding me of something I'd forgotten. Not words exactly, but a feeling, a memory of strength I'd once possessed. I remembered the conversation we'd had during his final week, when he was too weak to get out of bed but still alert enough to worry about my future. He'd made me promise something, made me swear that I wouldn't let anyone, not even Dylan, convince me that I was powerless. "You're stronger than you know," he'd whispered, his hand barely able to squeeze mine. "And you're not alone." I made sure of that. Sitting beside Robert's grave, I remembered the envelope he'd given me during those last days, the one he'd made me promise not to open until I truly needed it. The envelope that was still waiting in my jewelry box, sealed with wax and marked with his careful handwriting. For Marie, when she remembers who she is. I wasn't just Dylan's mother. I wasn't just Robert's widow. I wasn't just a woman waiting to be relocated to a senior community apartment. I was Marie Morrison, and I had been strong enough to raise a son, loyal enough to love a husband through 30 years of marriage, brave enough to sacrifice my own dreams for my family's happiness. Maybe it was time to remember what that strength could do when it was no longer being spent on people who didn't deserve it. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with 2 sets of papers in front of me. On the left, Dylan's legal documents waiting for my signature. On the right, Robert's sealed envelope, waiting for me to remember who I'd been before grief and betrayal had convinced me I was powerless. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't crying. For the first time since Robert's death, I wasn't afraid. I was something else entirely. Something Dylan hadn't seen coming. I was done being invisible in my own story. That night, I climbed the stairs to my bedroom with steady steps for the first time since Robert's death. My hands didn't shake as I opened my jewelry box, and my heart didn't race as I lifted out Robert's sealed envelope. The wax seal bore the impression of his wedding ring, and seeing it felt like receiving one last gift from the man who had loved me enough to prepare for this moment. I broke the seal carefully, reverently, and unfolded pages covered in Robert's familiar handwriting, the same neat script that had written me love notes for 30 years, that had signed birthday cards and anniversary gifts, and the mortgage papers for this house we'd made our home. "My dearest Marie," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing something that requires the strength I know you have, but may have forgotten. I've watched you these past months as I've gotten sicker, seen you doubt yourself, seen you accept treatment from Dylan that the woman I married would never have tolerated. So I'm writing to remind you who you are." I settled into Robert's reading chair, the one where he'd spent countless evenings working on crossword puzzles and reading mystery novels, and continued reading words that felt like him speaking directly to my heart. "You are the woman who worked 2 jobs to help pay for my law school, who never complained when I had to study instead of taking you out. You are the woman who stood up to my mother when she criticized your cooking, who told her firmly but politely that your kitchen, your rules. You are the woman who drove to Dylan's school and demanded they investigate when he was being bullied, who didn't leave until they promised to take action. I remembered that day. Dylan had been coming home with torn clothes and mysterious bruises, too ashamed to tell us what was happening. When I finally got the truth out of him, I'd marched into that principal's office like a lioness protecting her cub. I hadn't taken no for an answer, hadn't been intimidated by their bureaucratic excuses, hadn't left until they'd promised real action to protect my son. Where had that woman gone? When had I started accepting unacceptable behavior instead of demanding better? "I know Dylan has been different these past years," Robert's letter continued, "and I know you've blamed yourself, wondering what we did wrong. But the truth is, some people change when they taste success, and not always for the better. That doesn't mean we failed as parents. It means Dylan failed as a son. Dylan failed as a son." Robert had written those words with such clarity, such absence of self-blame, that they hit me like a revelation. All this time, I'd been assuming that Dylan's cruelty was somehow my fault, that I'd failed to teach him properly, that his lack of compassion reflected some deficiency in my mothering. But Robert was right. We'd raised Dylan with love, with values, with examples of kindness and loyalty and putting family first. The man he'd become wasn't our failure. It was his choice. "There's something else you need to know," the letter went on. "Something I haven't told you because I didn't want to burden you while I was still fighting this disease. Dylan came to see me 3 months ago while you were at your sister's helping with her surgery recovery. He didn't come to check on my health or spend time with his dying father. He came to discuss his inheritance." My hands tightened on the pages. 3 months ago, I'd spent a week helping Carol recover from her gallbladder surgery, grateful to have something useful to do while Robert endured another round of chemotherapy. I'd called home every night, and Robert had assured me that Dylan had visited, that they'd had good talks, that our son was finally showing more interest in spending time with his father. He had a folder with him, Robert wrote, filled with research about our assets, our insurance policies, the value of our house. He'd done his homework, Marie. He knew down to the penny what he stood to inherit, and he wanted to discuss maximizing the estate's value for tax purposes. Those were his exact words. I felt sick reading this, imagining my husband facing his own mortality while his son calculated the worth of his death. When I told him that everything would go to you first as it should, he became different, cold. He said he hoped I'd reconsider, that he had his own financial goals and had been counting on his inheritance to achieve them. He said Sarah had found some investment properties they wanted to purchase, and timing was important. Sarah. Even 3 months ago, she'd been in Dylan's ear, helping him plan how to spend money from his father's death. I realized then that we'd lost our son somewhere along the way, Robert continued. Not to tragedy or illness or circumstances beyond anyone's control, but to greed. Simple, ugly greed. And I decided that if Dylan wanted to treat his inheritance as a business transaction, then I would write the will accordingly. My heart began to beat faster as I turned to the next page, sensing that I was about to learn something that would change everything. The will Dylan has been discussing with you is not the complete document, Robert wrote. There is a codicil, a condition that he doesn't know about. I worked with my attorney to add it after Dylan's visit, when I understood what kind of man our son had become. A condition. That's what Robert had mentioned during our last conversation, when he'd been too weak to explain but strong enough to make me promise I would be okay, that he'd made sure I wouldn't be alone. The inheritance Dylan expects, his share of our life insurance, the house, the savings, all of it is contingent upon one simple requirement. He must live in our home and care for you personally for a minimum of 6 months after my death, not hire someone to care for you, not visit occasionally. He must move back home and provide the kind of daily, personal attention that a grieving widow deserves from her only child. I read that paragraph 3 times, hardly believing what I was seeing. Robert had found a way to give me what I needed most, either my son's genuine care and attention, or proof that he was incapable of providing it. If Dylan refuses this condition, or if he agrees but fails to honor it completely, the entire inheritance goes to you with no obligation to share any of it. The house remains yours. The life insurance becomes yours alone. Every penny we saved together stays with you, to do with as you see fit. Robert's trap was elegant in its simplicity. Dylan could have his inheritance, but only if he was willing to be the son I'd raised him to be. Only if he was willing to put family before money, to prioritize love over convenience, to remember that taking care of your parents was a privilege, not a burden. I know this might seem manipulative, Robert wrote, but I prefer to think of it as educational. Dylan has forgotten what matters, forgotten the values we tried to teach him. This will remind him. Either he'll remember how to be a good son, in which case you'll have him back and he'll deserve his inheritance, or he'll refuse, in which case you'll be better off without him and better off with the money. The letter continued with practical details. The name of Robert's attorney, instructions for when and how to reveal the codicil, suggestions for what I might do if Dylan refused the terms. But I was barely reading those parts, too stunned by the brilliance of what my husband had done. He'd given me a gift more precious than money. He'd given me truth. Dylan would have to choose between his inheritance and his convenience, between his financial gain and his willingness to actually be present for his mother's grief. Whatever choice he made would reveal exactly who he'd become. I love you, Marie, the letter concluded. I love the woman you've always been, and I believe in the woman you still are underneath all this grief and confusion. Don't let anyone, not even our son, convince you that you're powerless or worthless or anything less than the remarkable woman I've had the privilege of loving for 30 years. You have more strength than you know, and now you have the means to use it. I set the letter aside and sat in the darkness of my bedroom, feeling something I hadn't experienced since before Robert's diagnosis. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone trying to change an unchangeable situation, but the solid, grounded hope of someone who had options, who had power, who had choices. Tomorrow, Dylan would probably call about those papers he'd left for me to sign. He'd expect my compliance, my resignation, my willingness to be managed and relocated according to his convenience. Instead, he was going to learn about Robert's condition. He was going to discover that his inheritance came with strings attached, strings that would require him to remember how to be human, how to be family, how to be the son I'd raised him to be. I thought about the letter Dylan had written to his future self, about the boy who had promised to take care of his parents when they got old. Robert's will was going to test whether any trace of that boy still existed, whether Dylan's greed was stronger than whatever love might still survive in his heart. Either way, I would finally have my answer. Either I would get my son back, or I would be free of him completely, with the financial security to build whatever life I chose. For the first time since Robert's death, I went to sleep without crying. Instead of grief and helplessness, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Anticipation. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, Dylan would learn that his mother wasn't the powerless, grieving widow he thought he could manipulate and discard. Tomorrow, he would learn who I really was. It wasn't going to be pain anymore. It was going to be justice. I woke up the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. While coffee brewed, I called Robert's attorney, Jonathan Hartwell, the man who had helped us write our wills and who had become a friend over the years. When I explained why I was calling, his voice warmed with something that sounded almost like relief. "Marie, I've been wondering when you'd reach out," he said. "I've been waiting for Dylan to contact me about the complete terms of the will, but he never has. I think he assumes the documents he obtained through his own attorney tell the whole story." "They don't?" Jonathan chuckled, but it wasn't entirely pleasant. Not even close. Robert was very specific about how this should be handled. Dylan received copies of the basic will through probate, but the codicil with the caregiving condition was sealed separately, to be revealed only when you felt ready to proceed. We scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. I spent the morning moving through my house with purpose, seeing everything differently now that I understood my position. This wasn't a home I was about to lose. It was a home I could choose to keep or sell, depending on what Dylan decided to do with the choice Robert had given him. I cleaned with more energy than I'd had in weeks, not the desperate cleaning of someone trying to prepare for unwanted visitors, but the satisfied cleaning of someone taking care of something that belonged to her. I watered the plants Robert had given me over the years, plants I'd been neglecting because I'd assumed I'd have to abandon them soon anyway. In the garden, I picked tomatoes that were finally ripening, thinking about how Robert had planted them during his last spring when he was still strong enough to dig in the soil but weak enough that he had to rest between rows. He'd been planning for a harvest he wouldn't live to see, but somehow he'd known I would be here to gather the fruits of his labor. The phone rang around 11, Dylan's name on the caller ID, but this time I didn't feel the familiar stab of hope and disappointment. This time, I felt something else entirely. "Hi, Dylan. Mom, I called yesterday about those papers. Did you sign them yet?" His voice carried the same impatient edge it had developed over the past few weeks, the tone of someone who expected immediate compliance with his demands. "Not yet," I said calmly. "What's the holdup?" "I told you, the buyers want to close next week." "I've been thinking about what you said, about how your priorities have changed since high school." I kept my voice neutral, conversational, giving no hint of what I now knew. It made me realize that mine might be changing too. There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "Well, I've been assuming I had no choice about selling the house, moving to a senior community, following your timeline for everything. But maybe I have more options than I thought." Another pause, longer this time. When Dylan spoke again, his voice carried a note of something I hadn't heard before: uncertainty. "Mom, we've been through this. You can't afford to keep the house. Without Dad's income—" "You might be right," I interrupted gently. "Or you might not be. I think I should talk to a lawyer before I sign anything permanent." The silence stretched between us, and I could almost hear Dylan's mental calculations shifting, his assumption of easy victory suddenly looking less certain. That's probably smart," he said finally, though he didn't sound like he meant it. "Just don't take too long. The real estate market can change quickly." After I hung up, I realized I was smiling. For the first time in our recent conversations, Dylan had sounded like he was the one unsure of his ground. At Jonathan Hartwell's office that afternoon, I sat across from the man who had helped Robert plan this moment. Jonathan was in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of calm demeanor that came from decades of helping people navigate their most difficult decisions. "Robert was very thoughtful about this codicil," Jonathan explained, spreading the relevant documents across his mahogany desk. "He wanted to be fair to Dylan while protecting your interests and ensuring you received the care and respect you deserve." He walked me through the legal language, translating it into terms I could understand. The condition was ironclad. Dylan had to provide personal daily care for me for 6 consecutive months. Not just visits, actual residency in our home, actual responsibility for my daily needs, actual presence during my grieving process. If he accepts the condition but fails to meet it completely, if he moves out early, hires someone else to take over his responsibilities, or simply doesn't provide adequate care, the inheritance reverts to you in its entirety, Jonathan explained. Robert was very specific about that. And if he refuses outright? Same result. Everything goes to you immediately, with no further obligation to share any of it. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the attention of someone who had spent his career reading people in crisis. "Marie, I have to ask, what outcome are you hoping for?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been pondering since reading Robert's letter. Did I want Dylan to accept the condition and return to being the son I'd raised? Or did I want him to refuse, revealing his true character while freeing me from any further obligation to someone who clearly didn't value our relationship? "I want the truth," I said finally. "I want to know definitively whether the boy I raised still exists somewhere inside the man Dylan has become, or whether that boy is really gone forever." Jonathan nodded approvingly. "Robert said you'd feel that way. He knew you'd rather have an honest answer than false hope." We spent the next hour discussing the practical aspects of revealing the codicil to Dylan. Jonathan would call him that evening, schedule a meeting for the following day, and present the terms in his office with me present. This wasn't something that could be handled over the phone or through intermediaries. Dylan needed to see the legal documents, understand the binding nature of the condition, and make his choice with full knowledge of the consequences. "One more thing," Jonathan said as I prepared to leave. Robert left specific instructions about how long Dylan should have to make his decision. 24 hours. He felt that someone's immediate reaction would be more honest than a response they had time to calculate and manipulate. 24 hours to choose between easy money and hard work, between inheriting wealth and earning it through service, between treating his mother like an obstacle and treating her like family. I drove home feeling like I was seeing my neighborhood, my street, my house with new eyes. Every detail seemed sharper, more vivid, as if I'd been living in a fog for weeks and was finally able to see clearly. The garden where Robert had taught Dylan to throw a baseball, the driveway where I'd taught Dylan to ride a bike, the front porch where we'd sat as a family on summer evenings, talking about everything and nothing while Dylan caught fireflies in mason jars. Either Dylan would choose to remember what those places meant, what family meant, what love was supposed to look like, or he would choose money over memories, convenience over connection, selfishness over sacrifice. That evening, I prepared dinner for myself with more care than I'd shown for anything in weeks. I set the table with my good china, lit candles, opened a bottle of wine Robert and I had been saving for a special occasion. If this wasn't special, this moment when I reclaimed my power and prepared to discover the truth about my son, then nothing was. As I ate, I thought about the different ways tomorrow's meeting might unfold. Dylan might be shocked, realizing for the first time that his actions had consequences. He might be angry, feeling trapped by conditions he hadn't expected. He might be calculating, trying to find loopholes or alternatives that would give him what he wanted without requiring what he owed. Or, and this was the outcome I hardly dared to hope for, he might remember the boy he used to be, the teenager who had written about the importance of family, the son who had once promised to take care of his parents when they got old. Whatever happened, I would finally know who Dylan really was. And more importantly, I would finally remember who I was. Not a powerless widow waiting to be managed, but a woman with choices, with strength, with the means to determine her own future. The phone rang around 8 o'clock. Jonathan's voice was professional but warm. "I've spoken with Dylan," he said. "He's agreed to meet tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I didn't give him any details, just said there were additional aspects of his father's will that needed to be discussed." He sounded curious. Curious. That was one way to put it. How did he react to having to meet in person? He tried to insist that everything could be handled over the phone, but I was firm about the meeting being necessary. He wasn't happy about having to rearrange his schedule, but he agreed. Of course he wasn't happy about the inconvenience. Dylan had grown accustomed to having everything arranged for his convenience, to having his needs and timeline take priority over everyone else's. Tomorrow he would learn that some things, important things, life-changing things, required his presence, his attention, his willingness to show up whether it was convenient or not. After I hung up, I walked through my house one more time, not with the desperate urgency of someone saying goodbye, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood, finally, that this was my home until I chose otherwise. Tomorrow, Dylan would face the same choice Robert had faced when he wrote the codicil, the same choice every adult eventually faced, whether to do what was easy or what was right, whether to prioritize himself or his family, whether to honor the values he'd been taught, or abandon them for personal gain. Whatever Dylan chose would reveal everything I needed to know about the man my son had become, and whatever he chose, I would be ready. I arrived at Jonathan's office 15 minutes early, wanting to be settled and composed when Dylan walked in. I chose the chair across from Jonathan's desk, the one that would give me the clearest view of my son's face when he learned the truth about his inheritance. Dylan arrived exactly on time, wearing his most expensive suit and carrying the leather briefcase that had become his constant companion. He kissed my cheek perfunctorily, the kind of greeting you give to distant relatives at obligatory family gatherings, then settled into the chair beside me with the confident air of someone who expected this meeting to be a formality. "So, what's this about?" he asked Jonathan, pulling out his phone to check messages. "Mom said there were additional aspects of Dad's will?" Jonathan folded his hands on his desk, studying Dylan with the measured gaze of someone who had spent decades watching people receive unexpected news. "There is indeed an additional component that we need to discuss. A codicil that your father added to his will approximately 3 months before his death." Dylan's fingers paused over his phone screen. "A codicil? My attorney didn't mention anything about additional conditions." "Because your attorney was provided only with the basic will," Jonathan explained calmly. "The codicil was sealed separately, with instructions that it be revealed only when your mother felt ready to proceed with its terms." I watched Dylan's face as the implications began to register. His confident expression flickered, replaced by something warier, more alert. He set his phone face down on the desk and gave Jonathan his full attention for the first time since arriving. "What kind of conditions?" Jonathan opened a file folder and removed several documents, spreading them across his desk where Dylan could see the official seals, the legal signatures, the unmistakable authority of properly executed legal instruments. "Your father was very specific about his intentions," Jonathan began, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when reading important legal documents. "The inheritance you've been discussing with your mother, your share of the life insurance policy, half the value of the family home, and your portion of all other assets, is contingent upon you fulfilling one requirement." Dylan leaned forward, his businessman's instincts recognizing the importance of details he hadn't anticipated. "What requirement?" "You must reside in the family home and provide personal, daily care for your mother for a minimum period of 6 consecutive months following your father's death." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge thrown down by a ghost. Dylan's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like panic. "Personal care?" he repeated. "What does that mean exactly?" Jonathan consulted the documents with deliberate precision. "According to the codicil, you must live in your childhood home, prepare meals for your mother, assist with household maintenance, provide transportation to medical appointments and social engagements, and generally ensure that she receives the kind of daily attention and companionship that a grieving widow deserves from her only child." "For 6 months?" Dylan's voice had risen slightly, losing some of its professional control. 6 consecutive months, Jonathan confirmed. "If you move out before the time period is complete, if you hire someone else to fulfill your responsibilities, or if you fail to provide adequate care as determined by your mother's reasonable assessment, the inheritance reverts to her entirely." Dylan turned to look at me for the first time since Jonathan had begun explaining the codicil. I met his gaze steadily, letting him see that I wasn't the confused, manageable widow he'd been dealing with for the past month. I was the woman who had raised him, who had fought for him when he was bullied, who had sacrificed her own ambitions to ensure his success, and who remembered what strength looked like. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a note of something I couldn't quite identify. "Did you know about this?" "I learned about it yesterday," I replied honestly. "Your father left me a letter explaining his reasoning." Dylan's jaw tightened. "And you agree with this manipulation?" The word manipulation sparked something inside me, and I felt the woman Robert had written about, the one who had stood up to bullies and demanded justice, rising to the surface. "Is it manipulation?" I asked quietly. "Or is it an opportunity for you to remember what family means?" Dylan stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the downtown area where he conducted his business, where he'd built his successful consulting firm, where he'd apparently learned to value transactions over relationships. "This is insane," he said, speaking to the window rather than to us. "I have a business to run. I have a life, responsibilities, commitments to clients. I can't just drop everything and move back home like I'm some unemployed college graduate." Jonathan's voice remained professionally neutral. "Your father anticipated that concern. The codicil specifically states that you may continue operating your business from the family home, that you may maintain your professional obligations as long as they don't interfere with your primary responsibility of caring for your mother." "Primary responsibility," Dylan repeated, turning back to face us. "You're talking about making me a live-in caretaker for 6 months. I'm talking about making you a son," I said, and something in my voice made both men go very still. Dylan stared at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the boy who had once promised to take care of me when I got old. But it passed quickly, replaced by the calculating expression of a man trying to find angles, loopholes, ways to get what he wanted without paying the price that had been set. "What if I refuse?" he asked Jonathan. "Then the entire inheritance goes to your mother immediately," Jonathan replied. "The house, the life insurance, all savings and investments, everything becomes hers with no further obligation to share any portion of it." I watched Dylan's face as he processed this information, saw him calculating the monetary value of what he would lose, weighing it against the inconvenience of what he would have to do to keep it. "How much are we talking about total?" he asked. The question revealed everything I needed to know about where Dylan's priorities lay, but Jonathan answered anyway. "Approximately $1.2 million. Dylan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the legal documents that had just transformed his expected windfall into a choice between money and morality. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "Of course," Jonathan replied. "Your father specified that you should have 24 hours to make your decision. Tomorrow at this time, you'll need to inform us whether you accept the terms of the codicil or forfeit your inheritance." 24 hours? Dylan's voice cracked slightly. "That's not enough time to reorganize my entire life. It's enough time to decide what matters to you," I said quietly. Dylan gathered his briefcase and headed for the door, then stopped and turned back to face me. For just a moment, his carefully constructed adult composure slipped, and I caught a glimpse of something raw and uncertain underneath. "Mom," he said, "is this what you want? Do you actually want me to move back home and take care of you? Or is this just Dad's way of punishing me from beyond the grave?" The question hung between us, honest in a way Dylan hadn't been with me in months. I could see that beneath his anger and calculation, he was genuinely confused, perhaps even hurt, by the discovery that his actions had consequences he hadn't anticipated. "What I want," I said carefully, "is to know who my son really is. I want to know if the boy who once wrote about the importance of family still exists somewhere inside the man who was willing to sell my home out from under me while I was still grieving his father." Dylan's face flushed, and I could see that my words had hit their mark. He remembered the letter, remembered the idealistic teenager who had promised to always put family first. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said, his voice tight with emotions I couldn't read. After he left, Jonathan and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. "What do you think he'll choose?" I considered the question carefully. "I think Dylan will choose whatever benefits him most financially. The question is whether 6 months of inconvenience is worth $1.2 million to him. And if he chooses the money, then I'll know that Robert was right to protect me from someone who sees his own mother as an obstacle to his prosperity." I gathered my purse and stood to leave. Either way, I'll finally have the truth. As I drove home, I thought about the expression on Dylan's face when he'd learned about the codicil, the shock, the anger, but also something else. Something that might have been recognition, the dawning understanding that his actions over the past months had been observed, judged, and found wanting by the father he'd apparently taken for granted. Tonight, Dylan would go home to his apartment and weigh his options. He would calculate the worth of his inheritance against the cost of earning it. He would consider whether 6 months of caring for his grieving mother was an acceptable price to pay for financial security. And tomorrow, I would learn whether I still had a son worth loving, or whether Robert's money would be better spent on the life I chose to build without Dylan in it. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid of the answer. I didn't sleep much that night, but it wasn't the restless tossing of anxiety that had plagued me for weeks. Instead, I lay awake with the quiet alertness of someone waiting for an important answer, someone who had finally asked the right question and was prepared to accept whatever truth emerged. At exactly 10 o'clock the next morning, my phone rang, Dylan's name on the caller ID, 24 hours to the minute after he'd learned about Robert's codicil. "Mom," he said without preamble, "I've made my decision." His voice carried none of the confidence I'd grown accustomed to over the past month, none of the business-like efficiency that had characterized our recent conversations. He sounded tired, maybe even defeated. "I'm listening," I said. There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, carefully, as if he were reading from a script he'd rehearsed but wasn't entirely comfortable with. "I can't do it, Mom. I can't move back home for 6 months. My life, it's not set up for that kind of arrangement. Sarah and I have plans, business commitments, a future we're building. 6 months is too long, too disruptive to everything I've worked for." I closed my eyes and felt something settle inside my chest. Not disappointment exactly, because I'd been prepared for this answer, but a kind of final, definitive sadness. The boy I'd raised was truly gone, replaced entirely by this stranger who could calculate the worth of his mother's grief, down to the penny, and find it insufficient motivation for inconveniencing himself. "I understand," I said quietly. "Do you?" Dylan's voice carried a note of something that might have been desperation. "Mom, you have to understand. This isn't about not loving you. It's about being practical, being realistic about what's possible at this stage of my life. Being practical." The same phrase he'd used to justify selling my home, relocating me to a senior community, dismantling everything Robert and I had built together. Dylan had turned practicality into a weapon he used against anyone whose needs conflicted with his convenience. "Dylan," I said, "do you remember what you wrote in that letter to your future self when you were 17? Another pause. "Mom, that was... You wrote that you hoped you'd remember what matters. You hoped you'd take care of your parents when they got old, like they took care of you when you were young. You wrote that love is the only thing that really lasts." The silence stretched between us, and I could almost hear him struggling with the weight of his own words, his own broken promises to himself. "People change, Mom," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes," I agreed, "they do. And now I know who you've changed into." Dylan cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted back toward the business-like efficiency he was more comfortable with. "So, what happens now? With the inheritance, I mean. Now, Jonathan calls you to confirm your decision officially, and the inheritance becomes mine entirely," I explained. "All of it, as Robert intended if you made this choice. And you're okay with that? You're okay with Dad essentially disinheriting me?" The question revealed so much about how Dylan saw the situation, not as a choice he was making, but as something being done to him, some unfair punishment rather than the natural consequence of his own decisions. "Dylan," I said gently, "your father didn't disinherit you. He gave you a choice between money and family, and you chose money. Robert just made sure there were consequences for that choice." "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," I interrupted. And there was steel in my voice now, the strength Robert had written about in his letter. "You had the chance to be the son you once promised to be, and you decided it was too inconvenient. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are now." After I hung up, I called Jonathan to inform him of Dylan's decision. There was no surprise in the attorney's voice, just the weary recognition of someone who had seen this pattern too many times before. "I'll draw up the paperwork to transfer everything to your name," he said. "It should be finalized within the week. Within a week, I would officially own my home, have access to all the life insurance money, control all the savings Robert and I had accumulated together. Within a week, I would be financially secure enough to live independently for the rest of my life, free from anyone who saw my needs as obstacles to their own ambitions. But more importantly, I would be free from the exhausting hope that Dylan might remember how to love me." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since before Robert's illness. I planned for my future. I spread real estate brochures across my kitchen table, not for senior communities, but for the small coastal cottage I'd always dreamed of, the kind of place where I could wake up to ocean sounds and spend my days reading, gardening, maybe even learning to paint. I could afford it now. I could afford anything I wanted, within reason. More importantly, I could afford to choose, to make decisions based on what would make me happy rather than what would be convenient for someone else. The house phone rang around 5 o'clock. For a moment, I hoped it might be Dylan calling back, maybe having reconsidered his decision, maybe having remembered that some things were more valuable than money. But it was Sarah's voice on the line, tight with barely controlled anger. "Marie, this is ridiculous. Dylan told me about the will, and I think you need to reconsider what you're doing to your own son." The audacity of it took my breath away. This woman who had spent an afternoon cataloging my possessions like a vulture, who had discussed selling my home as casually as someone planning a dinner menu, was calling to lecture me about how I should handle my own inheritance. "Sarah," I said calmly, "this is between Dylan and me. It doesn't concern you." "Of course it concerns me. Dylan and I are building a life together, and your husband's manipulative will is interfering with our plans." Manipulative. The same word Dylan had used, as if giving someone a choice between selfishness and sacrifice was somehow unfair. "Robert's will gave Dylan exactly what he deserved," I said. "The opportunity to earn his inheritance by being the son he was raised to be. Dylan chose not to take that opportunity. You can't seriously expect him to put his life on hold for 6 months just to babysit." "To babysit?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended. "Is that what you think caring for your grieving mother-in-law would be? Babysitting?" Sarah's voice grew colder, more calculating. "Look, Marie, be realistic. You're eventually going to need care anyway. Wouldn't it be better to use Dylan's inheritance to pay for professional help rather than forcing him to sacrifice his career?" Professional help. Paid strangers instead of family. Sarah was suggesting that love could be outsourced, that the bond between mother and son was worth less than whatever business opportunities Dylan might miss during 6 months of actually being present for his family. "Sarah," I said quietly, "Dylan made his choice. Now you'll both have to live with the consequences." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and marveled at the clarity that had emerged from weeks of confusion and pain. Robert's codicil hadn't just protected my financial security. It had revealed the truth about the people in my life, forced them to show me exactly who they were when their interests conflicted with their obligations. Dylan was someone who could calculate the monetary value of his mother's love and find it insufficient. Sarah was someone who saw family relationships as business transactions. Together, they were building a life based on acquisition rather than affection, success rather than sacrifice. They were welcome to that life. I was building something different. Over the following weeks, as Jonathan finalized the inheritance paperwork and I began planning my move to the coast, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Robert's diagnosis. Excitement about the future. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to change an unchangeable situation, but the genuine anticipation of someone who had choices, who had freedom, who had learned to value her own worth. Dylan called twice more during those weeks, both times to suggest compromises that would give him some portion of the inheritance without requiring him to fulfill Robert's condition. I listened politely to his proposals, his calculations, his appeals to fairness, and declined them all. The boy who had written about love being the only thing that really lasts was truly gone. In his place was a man who believed everything lasted only as long as it was profitable, only as long as it served his immediate interests. 3 months later, I was sitting on the porch of my new cottage, watching sunrise paint the ocean in shades of gold and pink that no amount of money could buy. The cottage was small but perfect, with a garden where I was learning to grow herbs and vegetables, with neighbors who stopped by for coffee and conversation, with rooms filled with only the things I chose to keep because they brought me joy. I thought about Robert often, grateful for the gift he'd given me, not just financial security, but the truth about my own strength, my own worth, my own capacity to build a life that honored love rather than merely accumulating wealth. Sometimes I thought about Dylan too. Wondered if he ever remembered the boy he used to be, if he ever regretted choosing money over family. But mostly, I felt grateful that Robert had forced that choice into the open, had made it impossible for me to waste any more years hoping Dylan might remember how to love me. I had learned something profound in those dark weeks after Robert's death, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses, even if that someone is your own child. Sometimes love means holding people accountable for their choices, even when those choices break your heart. In my new life by the ocean, surrounded by beauty I'd chosen and peace I'd earned, I understood finally what Robert had been trying to tell me in his letter. I was stronger than I knew. I was worth more than Dylan's calculations had suggested, and I was capable of building something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal and disappointment. I had lost a son, but I had found myself, and in the quiet satisfaction of that trade, I discovered that some kinds of freedom are worth any price. Love might be the only thing that really lasts, but sometimes learning to love yourself is the most important lesson of all.